Welcome to Nightmare Whispers. Before we begin, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Because some stories are meant to be heard in the dark. Tonight's tale is stitched in silence and soaked in shadows. When justice goes unanswered, sometimes something older answers for us. So close your eyes and listen closely. This is The Dolls. Sweet dreams, if you can. My daughter used to see me reading no sleep stories and ask me to read to her. That's when her obsession with horror began. I found a story that was tame and dumbed it down so she could understand it. I thought it would still scare her, but the whole time she had a huge smile on her face. So I kept reading to her. Usually, one story a day, but sometimes I'll dangle a second story as an incentive for her to behave. A lot of your posts get a little gruesome, so most of the time I'll add in Scooby-Doo and a few more hijinks and less bloody murder, to make it a little more child-friendly so she is only slightly spooked but still enthralled. When I got a new laptop for work, I wiped the memory. I made sure to uninstall all of the browsers too so she couldn't use the internet, just in case she figured out how to connect Wi-Fi. That way she could play games like Freddy Fish or Pajama Sam, and I don't have to worry about her going onto the internet and stumbling upon something she shouldn't. She started using the laptop to write her own short horror stories. Every time she finished a story, she would email me it by printing them out and putting them in an envelope she wrote a big E on and handing them to me. She would always beg me to drop whatever I was doing to read it. Whenever I finished, she would always ask if her story had scared me, but I never had the heart to tell her that her stories were more adorable than scary. They were mostly about princesses getting taken by bad guys, or kittens fighting off monsters, and almost all of her stories had Scooby-Doo in them. Like father, like daughter, I suppose. Even though I obviously wasn't spooked, I would always tell her that she scared me, and she would always respond the same way. No way. Daddies aren't scared of anything. Now I'm certain any parent out there can tell you that is a load of shit. We're afraid of so many things. I'm afraid of losing my job so I can't provide for my family, or something bad happening to my wife or daughter. I remember back when she was first born, it drove me crazy whenever my wife would turn her back on the cart when she was in it. I was paranoid that someone would snatch my little girl right out of the cart. After all, whenever a child gets kidnapped they always say, "I only looked away for a minute." The day came when one of my daughter's stories actually did scare me. It's kind of hard to explain it, so I'll just post the story. It went like this. Sherry's boyfriend went out and bought some magical pixie dust. He gave the pixie dust to Sherry and told her it was sugar. He was lying to her. Sherry was so excited that she ate a whole bunch with her nose. Then she started dancing. Then she started twitching. Then she died. No one ever found out what Sherry's boyfriend did. The fact that someone died in one of her stories was off-putting enough, but to obviously reference a drug overdose was not a normal thing for a 7-year-old to write about. When I finished reading the story, my daughter was looking up at me with her big grin asking, "Did I scare you?" I tried asking her where she heard this story, but she insisted she made it up. She grabbed my arm and kept asking me if she scared me. For a first time since she started writing, I honestly told her yes. "No way, daddies aren't scared of anything," she said, and she skipped off to go play. I showed the story to my wife and she looked at me with a scowl, scolding me for reading our daughter so many scary stories off of the internet. I told her that I'd never read her a story like this, and that I have never read her a story where someone died. I asked my wife if it was possible that our daughter had seen it on a TV show she left on. My wife said that she hadn't watched any adult shows without me in weeks. I was convinced that my daughter must have seen this story on TV, that my wife was just out of the room, or maybe someone at her school gave her the idea. I kept racking my brain trying to come up with an answer, but when she wrote another story a couple days later and it was back to her usual subject matter, I decided to let it go. About a week later, my wife texted me a link to a news site. A young girl named Cheryl died of a heroin overdose. Apparently she got the heroin from her boyfriend, who told her it was coke. The article said her death was being labeled as an accident and that her boyfriend wouldn't be charged at this time. It didn't take long for me to make the connection. Someone must have left the news on and my daughter heard this story. It's possible that she didn't even know that this story was her inspiration, she just remembers an event. I thought about trying to talk to her about drugs and the story again, but she was her usual self, so if the story is just a story to her, I didn't want her to make a connection to some horrible real event. More stories came, all standard fare. I would tell her that these stories are much better and much scarier than that Sherry story. It seemed like we were moving past everything, until she wrote another really scary story. Danny was bored, so he stole a car. Danny was a bad boy. He didn't realize that the car belonged to a bad man. When the bad man found Danny, he shot Danny in the head, then the bad man drove away. This story was worse than the first one. The somewhat childlike wording of the first story softened the blow and made it a bit easier to process. This story had no padding. It was there, in your face. Shot Danny in the head. I never thought I would hear those words from my little girl. My daughter was still just looking up at me with her big green eyes, waiting for me to say what I always said. I asked her where she heard this story, but just like she did with the Sherry story, she insisted she made it up. I told her that the story was mean and that she shouldn't write stories like this anymore. She argued with me and I ended up grounding her from writing. The next day I had to work late. I was waiting for my partner to finish a bit that I needed, so I thought I would take a second to see if I could find anything about my daughter's story. If she heard the first one on the news, she probably heard this one too. A little bit of Googling turned up a story about a boy named Daniel who was found dead near the interstate. The police thought it was a mugging gone wrong. Two things stuck out to me. 1. Daniel had previously served time in juvie for grand theft auto, and 2. He was shot in the head. I couldn't turn up any other stories with a victim named Danny, Dan, Daniel, or anything else that's similar. This had to have been the story she heard. The only problem was that the story was posted almost 24 hours after I read my daughter's story. That didn't make sense to me. I checked every news site I could find. They all said that Danny was killed the night after my daughter wrote the story about him. I went back and looked at the story about Sherry and it was the same. They found Sherry dead 2 days after my daughter wrote that story. How did my daughter write a story so eerily similar to a real-world event before that event even happened? It had to have been a coincidence, right? I was quiet when I went home that night, and so was my daughter. My wife told me that my daughter was sick and asked me if I was feeling under the weather as well. I told her that I was, which wasn't technically a lie, since I was feeling sick. I just don't think the pain in my stomach and the tightness in my chest had anything to do with the virus my daughter had. The next day at work was a fog for me, but I ended up getting out of work on time for once. When I got home I noticed that my daughter's laptop was on the kitchen counter, and my wife seemed to be in a very bad mood. When I asked about the laptop, my wife told me that since our daughter was sick in bed, my wife gave her the laptop so she could pass the time, but my wife had to take the laptop from her, and she isn't allowed to write any more stories. I asked her why she was so on edge, even though the answer was obvious. My wife pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of the trash can and handed it to me. She wrote another story, and I completely understand why my wife didn't want her writing anymore. Even typing it here makes my chest tighten up like crazy. Daddy got mad. Daddy tied me and Mommy up downstairs in the basement. I'm fine. I'm hungry and thirsty. Daddy brought my t-ball bat and hit Mommy with it until she stopped moving. After Daddy left, Mommy made scary noises for a while. Mommy hasn't made any noise in a while though. Daddy hasn't stopped crying since Mommy stopped moving. I hope Mommy and Daddy feel better. Archived post. New comments cannot be posted in votes. For a number of years I was a camp counselor at an overnight camp in the Muskokas. I loved it more than any job I've ever had, despite the non-existent pay, annoying campers, long days and short nights, crappy food, etc. For one, I got to tell as many scary stories as I could sputter out. There was nothing better than hanging around a dying campfire with a bunch of junior high kids who were demanding the scariest, most blood-curdling tales I knew. And I told them all, the babysitter and the eerie clown statue, the driver and the creepy gas attendant, the woman and her licking dog. I saved my best stories for the overnight trips we made in Algonquin Park. For non-Canadians, it's a massive park in the middle of Ontario, spanning nearly 8,000 square kilometers, when days would be spent canoeing on pristine lakes and nights would be spent around the fire, singing and making esmores and being as rowdy as the only people within miles could be. Once the kids had quieted down, I told them stories of a stalker in the woods with a face so horrifying it paralyzed all of its victims in fear, or the group of campers who decided to spend a night across the lake from an abandoned, or was it, insane asylum. On this particular night, I'd finished up the tales, once again insisting that they were entirely true, and sent the campers to their tents. It had been an exhausting day, and none of the 6 kids were in any mood to stay up later. My fellow counselor had also decided to pack it in, leaving just me on a fallen log next to the dying fire. I took a deep breath of the cool, fresh pine-scented air and looked out at the lake. The partial moon reflected off the glassy water, and on the other side I could see towering cliffs, going up several hundred feet. I considered whether we could canoe over, climb up a few dozen feet, and do some cliff jumping. I grinned. The camp director would have my head if we did that. If he found out. Movement at the very top of the cliffs caught my eye. There was a small light bobbing along the peak. At first I thought it was a star, but it was larger and gave off a golden glow. It slowly moved back and forth in a small arc. As I sat up and watched it, another appeared next to it, bobbing along the top of the cliff. Then another. And another. And a few more. My stomach dropped into my feet. I grabbed my bag and pulled my digital camera out, then focused it on the little glowing orbs and used the zoom function. I counted them. And then I counted again. Oh shit. In a flash I was up and running to the tents. Hey guys. Wake up. We gotta go. There was movement in the tents, and then I had 7 confused heads looking out at me. My co-counselor wore a mixture of concern and pure anger. I hate to do this, I continued, but the clouds are looking really threatening. There's a big rainstorm coming in. If we get caught in it, it's going to ruin our trip. Seriously? Laura, my co-counselor, asked. We're in the middle of the woods. Where would we go? I pulled a map and flashlight out of my bag. There's a ranger station a few kilometers south of us. I traced the path with my finger. Thank God. We can make it there in a few hours. The campers groaned. Can't we just go in the morning? No. I shouted, my voice echoing across the lake. I lowered it. Come on, let's get packed up and go. I'll tell you a story along the way. I smiled, though I could feel my lips quivering. It's my best one. I pulled a map and flashlight out of my bag. There's a ranger station a few kilometers south of us. I traced the path with my finger. Thank God. We can make it there in a few hours. The campers groaned. Can't we just go in the morning? No. I shouted, my voice echoing across the lake. I lowered it. Come on, let's get packed up and go. I'll tell you a story along the way. I smiled, though I could feel my lips quivering. It's my best one. That seemed to get them going, and within 10 minutes the tents were packed up and we'd begun our trek into the deep woods, with small flashlights our only guide. When I was confident we were moving at a steady pace, I allowed myself to relax and began to tell my favorite campfire story. Centuries before the European settlers made their way into the country, it was inhabited by the First Nations people. They had made the trip from across Western Canada, following the migration patterns of large animals such as buffalo and bison. Eventually they reached Ontario, at which point they split off into smaller groups of travelers, each searching for a section of land to call their own. Legend has it that one group, consisting of about 20 men, women and children, had ventured through this very area in search of a place to call home. Though it wasn't even the end of October, the weather had made a turn for the worse, and as the group journeyed around the lake, a fierce blizzard hit. Within an hour, the group found themselves in blinding snow and below-zero temperatures. The clothes they had on them were made for the fall, not this sort of weather, and there weren't any Canada Goose jackets around back then. But they pressed on. They didn't have any other choice. Night was falling as they reached a cliff bluff, which towered over a cold, choppy lake. There was no stopping for this group. They'd die if they didn't make it past the cliffs. But with darkness setting in and the snow falling even harder, visibility was almost non-existent. So one of the elders had an idea. Using the little kerosene they had left, he lit a lantern for each of the travelers and had them carry it in front of them, not so that they could see the cliffs, but so they could see who was in front of them, allowing them to all follow each other across the narrow bluffs. With the strongest of the men leading the way, the group began to cross the cliffs. The freezing, wet snow soaked every bone in their body. The harsh wind chilled any exposed skin and threatened to push them right off the rock. Their path was no more than a few feet wide, and would have been slippery to even the best of hiking boots, let alone hand-fashioned moccasins. Slowly, painstakingly slowly, they made their way up the cliffs, praying that whatever lay on the other side could shelter them from the intensifying storm. They were about halfway up, hundreds of feet above the lake, though it was well out of their vision. In fact, all they could see in this blinding storm was the lantern in front of them, acting as a beacon to guide their steps. If the light moved up, they moved up. If it went down, they moved down. Each of the travelers was almost in a trance, caring about nothing but the glowing orb a few feet away. For the leader, though, there was no such luxury. He moved forward blindly, feeling along the cliff with his free arm, though his skin was so numb he could barely feel anything. As the path wound back again, he made a misstep and lost his footing, just as a gust of wind blasted his back. He desperately grasped for the hold, but his frozen fingers couldn't get anything. With a terrified scream, he slipped off the cliffs and fell into the icy black lake. The rest of the party didn't see him fall, of course. All they saw was his glowing orb dropping away from the bluff and disappearing in the darkness. There was no time to mourn. They continued on, but the storm was worsening. After another minute, one of the children, his body unable to withstand the cold, dropped away, his lantern glowing until the choppy waters put it out. Another, having seen this, lost his balance and fell. This pattern went on until there were just 5 people left, fumbling along in the darkness, following the light in front. As hard as they tried, the cliffs were unforgiving. The remaining men fell down to 4. Then 3. And 2. And then there was just one left, who legend says cursed the earth as his legs slipped and he plunged hundreds of feet down, his lantern the last one to be extinguished. Of the 20 members who tried to overcome the cliffs, I finished, not one of them survived. They say that sometimes, when the conditions are right, you can see the orbs along the cliff, symbols of the lost travelers who will never find their homes. As the story ended, leaving the campers in an eerie silence, I saw lights up ahead. A wave of relief poured over me. We picked up the pace and found the ranger station bursting with activity, with a half-dozen people running around, loading up trucks and shouting into radios. The wind was beginning to really pick up, and I heard thunder in the distance. "Hey! You kids!" A large, burly man with a full beard and mustache ran up to us. "Get in the trucks. We don't have much time." Laura and I led the kids to one of the pickup trucks. "What's going on?" I asked the man. "Didn't you hear? Another gust of wind. Huge storm systems heading right for us. Already been tornadoes touched down. We're getting everyone out of here. Let's go." We all climbed into the truck's bed. I collapsed down, feeling like I'd just been punched in the gut. The ranger climbed into the front and we took off down a makeshift road. My head was spinning. It wasn't possible. How? Laura slid next to me, keeping her voice low. "How did you know we had to get out of there?" I looked over at her. My face felt empty of any blood. "I saw the lights. What? No. No. She gasped, then caught herself. How many? I took a deep breath. 8. Lying against each other, asleep despite the bumpy road. That's all of us. My God. I nodded and leaned against her. Laura had heard the traveler's story before, and she knew that I'd left out a key bit of information. The lights were real, but they were never random. If they were shining, bobbing back and forth, swinging in a small arc, it was because they had a message. A warning. One light would shine, for each person who was about to die. I've wanted to be a horror writer since I first blew through 60 Goosebumps books in elementary school. As I got older, my interest quickly shifted to Christopher Pike, and then Stephen King and Dean Koontz. At first, my parents were thrilled that I was reading at all, but when my mom started catching on to exactly what I was reading, she got worried. "You're going to give yourself nightmares," she said, but I basically laughed in her face. Nothing scared me. It was all silly. Even Pennywise in it or Randall Flagg in The Stand just seemed like cartoons to me. At some point, I decided the only way to discover something genuinely scary was to write it myself. Of course, I went through all of the common pitfalls of a rookie writer, copying my idols, generating page after page of drivel. It wasn't until college that I actually started coming up with stories that didn't stink like hot garbage. Finally, when I was a senior, I wrote the first one that I was actually proud of. It was about a space station that ran out of food, and rescue is years away. The chief scientist calculates that he'll have just enough calories to make it in time, if he eats the rest of the crew. I was so excited to finally show it to someone that I emailed it to my girlfriend and asked her to tell me what she thought. I sent the email and then drove over to her place so I could hear her reaction in person. When I got there, she was in tears. I asked her if she liked the story, and she said that she couldn't even look at me, that I was disgusting. I told her to relax. It was just a story after all, but she just started screaming that there was something wrong with me and that I needed to get out of her house right then. It was sad to lose her, but it didn't change how I felt about the story. I ended up sending it to a few magazines, but I didn't hear back. I guess I figured that it wasn't scary enough. And if I'm going to be honest, a bit of self-doubt was beginning to creep in. Maybe there was something wrong with me. Maybe some kind of gauge had broken inside of me such that my whole concept of terror was different from the rest of humanity. Maybe I should just stop writing and get an office job. A couple of months after that, I was lying awake at night when I felt something heavy on my chest. I looked down to see what was sitting there, but all I could make out was a shadow. "You're close," it said. "You can't hold back now." I woke up gasping. Of course, I took it as a sign. I started my next story that very morning. And if I'm going to be honest, this one felt different than anything I'd written before. It was like the monster I was writing about was embracing me from behind, curling its fingers around mine, guiding them on the keyboard. Then, it was like I blinked, and the whole thing was already written out on the page, a couple thousand words. I scrolled up in my doc, and it was like I was reading it for the first time. And as I went, I actually felt my body tensing, my pulse quickening, all of the stuff I'd read about in novels but never actually experienced myself. I was actually afraid. Shaking, I quickly shut my computer screen. It was immediately apparent to me that I'd written a story scarier than anything I'd ever read, and since I'd read practically everything, there was a good chance it was the scariest story ever created. My first thought was to post it somewhere online for maximum exposure. I was just about to post it online when I hesitated. Maybe it would be better to run it by a few test readers first. I hadn't even really done a proper grammar check, after all. That afternoon, I went to my parents' house with a few printouts of the story. My parents were glad to see me, of course, but a little wary of reading my story. They exchanged a funny look but ultimately agreed to give it a look. I waited downstairs as they each went to their upstairs study to read in the coziest chairs. The seconds ticked by painfully. I couldn't wait to hear what they thought. I imagined their pride as they realized that not only was their son a real writer, but that he'd actually written the scariest story ever. And then I heard a shattering of glass, followed by a thump. I ran outside to find my mother's body in a heap surrounded by fragments of the upstairs window as well as my manuscript pages. I ran to her, trying to shake her awake but found her completely lifeless. I was about to call 911 when I looked up and saw my father standing at the same window. He was shaking with fear as he picked a piece of broken glass from the window and ran it across his throat. Then, as the blood trickled down his neck, he fell lifelessly down, landing with a thump on top of my mom. I guess I should have been scared, but if I'm going to be honest, the sight of my dead parents was practically a walk in the park compared to the story. I felt sad seeing them like that, but not like I needed to scream bloody murder or anything. A bloody page blew out from under my mother's corpse and clung to my chest. I pulled it slowly off my body, and as I did, I reread one of the sentences. A chill ran through me. My whole body was shaking, and I fell to my knees. I felt like the words were looking at me, seeing something deep and rotten inside. I felt like the words would eat me down to my disgusting bones. I felt that if I read even one more word, I'd have the same uncontrollable urge they felt, that I'd want to walk upstairs and leap from that very same window. And even though I knew the story was the best, that it was the scariest, and that it was mine, I didn't want to read it anymore. That was all a couple of weeks ago. Since then, I've been trying to decide what to do about the story. Part of me knows that if I put it out there, people would finally recognize my talent. Maybe I'd be getting calls of congratulations from King and Pike and R.L. Stein and all my idols, praising my talent, begging me to write more. Or maybe a bunch of people would end up like my parents. But if I'm going to be honest, the main thing stopping me from posting it is the risk. The risk that I'd accidentally read a couple of sentences and feel the fear again, that inescapable dark bubbling from somewhere deep and unknowable. It's that thing I thought I was chasing all along, but when I finally found it, I broke. I'm working on my mom's laptop for now so I don't have to open the one with the story. But I know I can't just let it sit there forever, unread. It would be like keeping the Mona Lisa in a dark basement, away from all human eyes, right? Anyway, thanks for listening. Some gifts never lose their power. And some names are never truly forgotten. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who dreams in shadows too. Until next time. Sleep deep, and whisper carefully.